Okay, thank you, Danny. Um, this is me kind of reading to you what the message we sent out. We have about 270 people in southeastern Michigan that get our invitations. But this is what information I sent to them about hearing you speak. It said it's well known that the Trump administration has been ruthless in arresting, detaining, and deporting immigrants without allowing these persons to have due process. You're invited to hear an online presentation on standing up for immigrants' rights at 11 a.m. And I proceed to give them the links for joining the meeting, and then also give more background on you, which I will read now so that it'll hopefully won't miss a lot of things. There's so much more we could say, but Professor um, Balgamwalla, did I pronounce that right? Has a deep background in helping immigrants seeking asylum and securing their rights through clinics in Detroit, North Dakota, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. She also has been the has senior lawyer project experience working for the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines. So Sabrina, I hope I got all those things right, but I got them off the Wayne State University page that gave a little of your background. So you have local, national, and international experience with immigrant rights. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor uh, Balgamwalla.
Little Warriors.
Hello, I'm thrilled to be with you all today, especially since so many of you have busy plans for later, which I think is wonderful. So I have a presentation today, but we're a small group, and so I want you to feel comfortable interrupting me at any point to ask questions, or if there's anything you want me to talk more about. I'm totally happy to do that. This really should be about the questions you have and the things that you want to know. I'm going to try to share my... Danny, can you give me permission to share my screen?
Okay, let's see here. Allow to. Let's see here if we've got Sabrina. Danny, can you help us out with this? Okay.
Oh, it's all right. Here we go.
Is it coming to you now?
It is, yeah. Thank you. Sometimes it's just, I taught during the pandemic over Zoom, and I found that my students just really wanted to see something other than my face. So this is a little visual for you. It's not super top heavy, but yeah, I'm going to be talking about standing up for immigrant rights today. Oh, there's my title, my information. See Lon's wearing a Wayne State shirt. Go Warriors. So there are a couple things I wanted to talk about today. I'm sure this doesn't cover everything that you've heard about or all of the issues that are facing immigrant communities, but hopefully I'm going to hit the highlights here. One is the issue of immigration enforcement and immigration detention. I know Randy emphasized those. And termination of legal statuses and barriers to obtaining legal protection, which are some things that have sort of been going on behind the scenes that lawyers certainly have been very attuned to, and and they're sort of feeding the immigration enforcement and deportation problems that that the community is facing. So I'm going to talk about each of these things a little bit. And like I said, if you have any questions, feel free. Since I won't be able to see everybody's hand, you should just feel free to speak up if you have any questions. Okay, so I was also struggling to find pictures that I could show that I weren't super triggering. So this is a picture of immigration and customs enforcement officers. They look sort of the way that we started thinking about them, which is with their faces are covered, mostly wearing plain clothes. You can see one's wearing a vest that says police. And I show this slide because immigration enforcement, I think, is the issue that's on the top of all of our minds. It's certainly making headlines. We see a lot of footage in the news about immigration arrests. And this has been one of the harder things, I think, about community work, because when we do know your rights presentations, we tell people, like, here are some of the things you can do to protect your rights. If you're at home, you don't have to let anyone in unless they have a judicial warrant. You should ask to see it through the window or slide it through the mail slot because they probably don't have one, and you don't have to open the door or let them in if they warrant. We tell people that if you're on the street or you're in your car and you've been stopped, you can invoke your right to remain silent. You can ask what law enforcement agency someone is with and why they stopped you. You can ask to see their badge number. You can ask for their name. And if someone says, you can always ask if you're free to leave. And if the answer is yes, you can walk away. And all of that sounds very good in theory, but when we've seen the footage, the arrests are very aggressive. They're sometimes very violent. Many times you can't tell what agency these officers are from, or if they're law enforcement at all, right? If they're actually law enforcement, or if they're people posing as law enforcement officers. They certainly won't tell people their badge numbers, and they don't even show their faces. So the question I keep hearing from people is, can ICE do this? Or they can't do that, can they? And so I think it's helpful to kind of break down a little bit what ICE is required by law to do and why we're sort of seeing um, arrest patterns look the way they do in spite of the law enforcement agency's obligations. So in terms of the general procedures that someone is required to follow, an arrest should be made by an immigration officer if the officer has a reason to believe that the person to be arrested has committed an offense against the United States or is a non-citizen unlawfully present in the United States. And generally, a warrant, which is typically a civil warrant, shall be obtained except when the designated immigration officer has reason to believe that the person is likely to escape before a warrant can be obtained. There are rules about the use of force. The agency is always required to use the minimum non-deadly force necessary to accomplish the mission, and that force can only be escalated when that use of force is warranted. And they're only allowed to use force that is objectively reasonable. But the agency has discretion to decide what that level of force is and hasn't defined the standard more specifically. ICE does not have a standard uniform, so that is why you can see people wearing plain clothes or different levels of identification about what agency they're from. They don't have a requirement to show their face, though 21 state attorneys general signed a letter to Congress asking them to pass a law to require all law enforcement officers to show their faces, but that is not the law as of now. And federal agents are required, when they're responding to civil disturbances, the law requires them to visibly display their IDs and agency affiliation unless they're exempted, and the exemption is usually under emergency circumstances. So when DHS, a spokesperson was asked for comment about why agents aren't showing their faces, or identifying themselves. The spokesperson says that they identify themselves as police while wearing masks to protect themselves from being targeted by known and suspected terrorist sympathizers. So this is the agency's rationale for why there are exceptions to law enforcement agents having to identify themselves. Um, in terms of accessing people's homes or work sites, there are warrant requirements. Most ERO agents act pursuant to a warrant when conducting immigration arrests, but as I mentioned, the warrant is administrative in nature. So that prevents an agent from entering into someone's home without first obtaining consent. So that's like what we tell people in the Know Your Rights presentation. A Chicago federal judge ruled last week that ICE violated a consent decree in conducting arrests without warrants. So this is, there's a consent decree in place that is supposed to protect people against warrantless arrests. And the way that ICE agents typically get around this is with the use of ruses. So if you've heard about a ruse, this is where a law enforcement agent lies, uses a false, presents false information about who they are and what they're doing at someone's home in order to encourage the person to come out or to gain access to the home. So in 2005, there was an internal agency memo that says that ICE agents cannot engage in ruses where they're posing as members of or agents of companies or offices that are involved with health and safety infrastructure. But just back in June, there were reports that law enforcement or that ICE was posing as utility workers in order to gain access to people's homes in Arizona. So they're not supposed to, but clearly sometimes they do pose as agents of health and safety organizations. They are also not supposed to use coercion, so they can't tell somebody that their house is on fire, for example, to get them to come out. But agents are actually encouraged to use ruses. They're encouraged to lie in order to get access to people's homes. ICE trainings actually lay out possible ruses that people could use. I know that one of my students who's enrolled in my clinic shared that someone in her uh, neighborhood just earlier this week had people come to the door posing as Jehovah's Witnesses, trying to get them to come outside, but they were only going to the homes of Spanish-speaking individuals. So yeah, ruses can take a lot of different forms. And this is allowed for various reasons. So there's a Supreme Court case, Lewis versus United States, that says that the use of deception by undercover police officers is not constitutionally prohibited, and they refuse to hold that the use of deception by law enforcement agents is per se unconstitutional. So ICE agents aren't the only ones who are allowed to use ruses. And but it's very hard to make a Fourth Amendment challenge against the use of ruses by ICE because does not preclude the use of evidence that's obtained through unconstitutional searches. Even so, there is a really interesting case that was initiated in the Los Angeles area in 2020 about the use of ruses. So the litigation began in 2020, and there was a settlement agreement finalized just in August of this year. So you can see how long the litigation takes when they're challenging constitutional issues in federal court, but there is now a settlement agreement in place that actually prevents. Well, so ICE agents are supposed to identify themselves. They can't just identify themselves as police or law enforcement. They have to say they're with immigration or they're with ICE. There are certain restrictions on the types of ruses they can use. And it'll be really interesting to see how that shakes out. The agency is required, so this applies only to the Los Angeles Field Office of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And that ICE office actually has to report on its compliance for the next 3 years. So it'll be interesting to see what that looks like. And it'll be interesting to see how that precedent might be useful for challenging the use of ruses and failure to identify as immigration enforcement in other jurisdictions. The other, I think, high profile issue that we're seeing with respect to people invoking their legal rights is this authority to profile. So you may be aware that the ACLU of Southern California filed a lawsuit challenging the use of profiling by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They filed suit in the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. And if you may have heard, the criteria are allow profiling based on race, language, particularly speaking of Spanish or speaking with an accent, the type of work that people are engaged in, and the place where they're working. And the ACLU's suit said that this violates the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable government seizure. And the Supreme Court stayed the TRO, reversing the lower court's judgment. So this isn't the final decision, but due to the Supreme Court's action, unfortunately, profiling is allowed to legally continue. So these are things that I think affect the immigrant communities. And because of the profiling, not just people who are non-citizens, but people who are citizens, but are of Latinx heritage. But we've also seen arrests of people not unrelated to immigration status at all, but it seems there's like a presence at an immigration related site. So people who are accompanying others to immigration court, or maybe protesting or reporting outside of facilities. And there's, I guess the idea is that there's an allegation of federal crime, usually disturbing the peace or trespassing. And we've seen arrest and detention of US citizens, as well as pregnant people, people with serious medical conditions. And immigration agents do have authority to detain Americans in limited circumstances. And some of that is because of people being profiled. So ProPublica did this study. They found that 170 people were arrested by ICE in these types of actions. 50 of them were Americans who were questioned about their citizenship. They were all Latino, so that's the profiling in action. And ProPublica also found there were about 130 Americans, including a dozen elected officials, who were accused of assaulting or impeding officers, and that's why they were arrested. And it seems that charges were actually never filed in any of those cases. In a few cases, there were people who pleaded guilty to misdemeanors, but it kind of that those facts sort of expose that these arrests happen first and the questions are asked later, right? That the circumstances actually aren't strong enough, invoking emergency or commission of a federal crime, that the circumstances are actually not there to substantiate an actual charge, even though people are arrested and terrorized. So that's sort of how things are playing out with immigration enforcement and arrests. Does anyone have any questions about any of that?
Yeah, this is Lon Herman. I was wondering if they do that, if they can't sue them for false arrest.
The question is, can they be sued? Can the ICE agents be sued for false arrest?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we haven't actually seen any lawsuits be filed, and I think that that's the other side of this, is because ICE authority to arrest is so broad. So even though there aren't enough circumstances to sustain a charge against the person who's been arrested, their ICE agents are covered in terms of their ability to actually have made those arrests in the first place if they later release people. Though it'll be interesting to see, there are some people who've sustained really serious physical injuries as the result of tactics that have been used, and it'll be interesting to see if any of that results in litigation.
Sabrina, can someone sue if they're an American citizen? Can they sue for false arrest?
So this is sort of what I was saying before, is that we it'll be interesting to see whether if anyone does, but because ICE authority to arrest is so broad, they are covered and often covered in terms of making those initial arrests. So a false imprisonment charge might be very difficult to make.
Question, please.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't get on screen.
Okay.
But the actions that are happening right now, has that been the rule for the last 10, 20 years, or is this all new?
So in terms of actions, are there particular things that you're thinking of?
Yes. Oh no, I mean just the whether it be the troops in the streets, the army in the streets, the whole thing, arresting. Um, I know there's been attempts in the past, but is this a one-time thing that we've never seen before?
Yeah, it's hard for me to say that we've never seen it before because I think this is sort of I tell people sometimes I feel like Cassandra. I'm like the lack of restrictions put on immigration and customs enforcement has led us to the situation we're in now. So this is, the agency that was created by an act of Congress beginning in 2003, and over the last 20 plus years has evolved as a rather, its basis is in emergency and security. That's sort of the thread that runs through the 22 different mandates that were united under the agency. And all the pieces were really there, I think, to create a non-accountable law enforcement agency. What's different now is ICE has a much larger budget, and the emphasis of their, I think the mandate they have is to do as many arrests as possible, and it seems that they're intentionally doing it in very high profile ways that create spectacle and are intended to instill fear in people. So maybe those techniques are a little bit different. But for example, under the Obama administration, we saw some of the worst raids at job sites that we had ever seen, ever. And that really struck terror in the hearts of communities, I think, because it's affecting US citizens now. And, uh, because I don't know, I think that folks are maybe noticing these things more, but they've always been happening.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I see someone else's hand is up.
Yeah, Paul?
Hi.
Yes, this is Paul Van Oyen. I'm having a little trouble with my screen here, but question I have is about the Border Patrol versus ICE. And, we live in Michigan, and supposedly the Border Patrol can only operate within such a, I don't know, 50 or 100 miles of the border. And that was the issue in Chicago, was it not? That they were saying that Chicago was on the border because it's on Lake Michigan, but that's a ludicrous thing because Lake Michigan doesn't even touch the Canadian border, international border. So did I miss that, or could you clarify who has the authority to enforce immigration laws, um, the Border Patrol versus ICE, and how far they can function from the border?
Sure. You definitely didn't miss that. I didn't mention it, but yeah, as you stated, Customs and Border Patrol can operate within 100 miles of an international border. The Great Lakes are considered an international border because they're international waters. Oceans are considered, international waters, and so areas on the coasts
Just a
fall within
second,
that 100.
the Great Lakes are considered international waters,
Yes.
even if they do not border another nation. I don't see how.
I didn't make the rule.
Challenged in court?
I didn't make the rule.
Has that been challenged? Yeah, but that doesn't make any sense. Lake Michigan does not go near the border.
All of the Great Lakes are considered international waters for purposes of the 100-mile rule. Airports are also considered part of the border because they're ports of admission.
Oh,
So,
okay, they're ports of admission, but not Lake Michigan. If you're in Lake Michigan, you're not going an international port, are you?
well, here's the thing. I don't really think geography is the point, right? I think that the agency wants to increase its ability to do enforcement in the interior and justify having a customs and border protection presence. It's the first CBP office in the United States was actually not, most people think about Border Patrol being associated with the southern border, which is historically true. The first CBP office was actually based in Detroit. And it's because of, post 9/11, that proximity to Canada and wanting that justification, I think, of addressing Muslim immigration in particular. So there's a level of construct to all of this, right? There are geographical facts, and then there is the legal concept that's attached to them. So I completely understand what you're saying, but like I said, I don't make the rules. This is how they've interpreted their authority.
Well, maybe somebody should take it to court because it doesn't make any sense.
It's been litigated. It has been litigated. Yeah.
And Sabrina, you mentioned airports too.
Yes.
Like how about an airport in Wichita, Kansas? Would that be part of an
If
international?
there are international flights that go there, there is Customs and Border Patrol presence.
I see Nick Shimatero has got his hand up.
I do. Can you hear me? I'd like you to expound a little bit more on the judicial decision that essentially allows racial or ethnic profiling. Strikes me as something that runs afoul of the 14th Amendment, if not the 5th and 6th Amendments. But what was that a Supreme Court decision? And
Yeah.
And what was the rationale? I'm not blaming you. I know you weren't sitting on the Supreme Court at the time this was decided. That is a relatively new decision. What was the rationale used?
So to be clear, the case I'm talking about is Vasquez Perdomo v. Nome. And what the Supreme Court hasn't actually issued an opinion on this case yet. It is still pending before the court. But there was a temporary restraining order placed on the order of the judge in the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California, who said that these profiling practices did violate the Fourth Amendment. And so the Supreme Court's TRO stayed the effect of that order. So the order, so the judges, the California judge's opinion decision isn't going into effect while the Supreme Court actually considers the outcome in Vasquez Perdomo v. Nome. And the fact that the TRO went into place really disturbs a lot of us because certainly we know that ICE is profiling. If you've ever had any interaction with CBP or ICE, you know that they profile. And so for the Supreme Court to uphold it, and it seems so blatantly. But I was just at a symposium last week with Kevin Johnson, who, if you know, he's an immigration scholar who focuses on constitutional law. He is optimistic about the Supreme Court. He thinks that that the chief judge doesn't want this to be his legacy of having legalized profiling, and he thinks that the Supreme Court is going to curtail the ability to profile. I love his optimism, so I guess we'll see what happens.
Well, I hope he's right, because basically what that decision did, other than the sorts of individual actions we all think about, is it led to what happened in Chicago, where they arrested or detained, and that's an arrest once you've detained, all of the residents of an apartment building, even
Right.
children, regardless of whether they were citizens, legal residents, or illegal. On the basis they argued they could detain everybody because they suspected that there were some illegal aliens, some aliens who were undocumented within the building. That's clearly that precedes the Fourth Amendment. I think that goes back to Magna Carta to make that sort of thing illegal, and it's the most offensive thing I've ever heard. Well, one of the most offensive.
Yeah, I know, right? All these things competing for the title of most offensive. But yeah, that's where we saw the judge issue the decision indicating that this was a violation of the consent decree, that those warrantless arrests were not permissible. Yeah. I have a couple more questions and then we will talk a little bit about detention.
Yeah, I see Lon Herman and then Paul.
Yeah, my question is can't the Supreme Court just kind of set this aside basically forever, or at least until it might be more advantageous time for them to rule again or for that lower court ruling?
That's a good question. Typically, cases are completed by the end of the term. So I think we probably will see a decision before the end of the term.
Okay, and Paul?
Hi, I just wanted to point out the total hypocrisy of the Trump administration, which, well, and the Supreme Court, I guess. It's the Supreme Court, where they're probably going to do away with the Voting Rights Act, which is supposed to prevent discrimination, racial discrimination. So on that hand, they're saying, oh, well, we can't consider race, is what they're going to say. We can no longer, it's been enough years. Although, of course, that one part that was overturned, as soon as the counties that were restricted, when they were no longer restricted, they obviously they did what their racial profiling to make the congressional districts the way they wanted to. But now, what the courts are doing, at least what ICE is doing, and the courts we're worried are going to support, is that they're saying you can do racial profiling. So you can do it in a negative way, but not a positive way, in a sense. You can't use race as a criteria in a positive way, but you can do it in a negative way. It just, to me, that is a total hypocrisy. And of course, it's not you we're talking about, but we're talking about the Trump administration and his courts that are going along with him.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted another tendency that the legal field, I don't know if there's any lawyers on this call. If so, please don't take this personally, because I say this about me too, is that we have a tendency to parse, right? And that as opposed to speaking plainly, that like taking different positions about the significance of race, that our legal system tends to parse those questions in ways that seems contradictory and sometimes unjust. Okay, so I definitely want to get you out of here by noon so you can have your board meeting and protest later this afternoon. So I'm just going to hit some of these things briefly. I wanted to mention immigration detention because I think it's another issue that's very high profile right now, but it's something that's been going on for a very long time. The United States has over 200 immigration detention centers. We don't know the exact number because the US government hasn't actually ever made that number totally public. It includes private immigration prisons, as well as ICE beds that are set aside in state and local prisons. The big news in this space is that in July 2025, Congress authorized $45 billion for the expansion of our immigration detention system. Just for context, in the previous fiscal year, the total spending was $3.43 billion. So that's over a 10 times increase in the amount of money available to hold people in these facilities. And folks who've worked with detainees know that there are no oversight mechanisms in this space. There are detention standards. So these are separate from the Department of Justice standards that are created for jails and prisons. But there is no watchdog agency associated with this. Congress has not actually exercised any authority to have any kind of oversight. And DHS regularly violates its own standards and with respect to overcrowding and poor sanitation, inadequate medical care. And the refrain that this constantly comes from the agency is that it's impossible to enforce these standards because they rely on this network of contracts and they have to detain people. And so they have to detain them in places where they're available, and they simply cannot compel all these different jails to comply with their standards. So Yeah, one thing that I think the Wall Street Journal is going to be reporting about this at some point is this phenomenon of people sort of being detained and going missing. And that's because the facilities have their own procedures for entering people in these systems, or that's what I said. That's what I think is going on. Is, people are held in Customs and Border Patrol custody, for example, which happens all the time here in Detroit, by the way, because people accidentally take that exit to the bridge for Canada and end up outside at that inspection station as a result of a wrong turn. And people can be detained there for 72 hours before they're transferred to an actual detention facility for more long-term detention. So those delays in entering people's information or when they're transferring them from one location to another, updating that information causes people to go missing in the detainee locator system, which is really, really distressing to family and loved ones who are trying to find somebody who's been detained or someone who doesn't come home. And you may know that people can be transferred anywhere in the country once they have been detained. And one of the things that I've been very concerned about is you may also know that different courts treat certain types of claims from non-citizens more favorably. So, for example, asylum grant rates can vary between 99% and 0.1%. That's how dramatic the difference is. In some jurisdictions, it's possible to be released on bond for $1,500. In other places, the bonds are much higher. Different circuits are more willing to hear habeas claims and release people on habeas. But immigration facilities, the large detention facilities, tend to be built in the rural South. These are concentrated in jurisdictions that tend to regard the rights of non-citizens more favorably. So essentially, ICE is choosing the venue in which these cases are going to be heard, and the majority of the time, they're very hostile venues. We've seen expansion of mandatory detention, which has been really distressing. So part of this is there's the Lake and Riley Act, which expands mandatory detention for non-citizens charged with certain offenses like shoplifting. So before I entered the academy, I did immigration work, but I also did family law. I was a domestic violence attorney. And so this news about shoplifting convictions resulting in mandatory detention is incredibly distressing to me because the number of my clients who did have to shoplift in order to feed themselves or their children when they were trying to escape a domestic violence situation or being denied money to make those purchases. So that's distressing. We're also seeing a broader application of expedited removal. So you'll remember over the summer, there were a lot of reports of people going to their immigration court hearings and being nabbed by immigration and customs enforcement and detained. And that's because this was affecting people who'd been in the country for less than 2 years. The definition of expanded detention, expedited removal was expanded. And so these people had to wait in detention in order to receive a credible fear interview before they could be released. And then under the Biden administration, we had the circumvention of lawful pathways rule, CLP, which states that you're not eligible for a bond if you entered the country without one of those CBP1 appointments on the app. And then the Board of Immigration Appeals issued a decision called Matter of Keeley, which takes the position that anyone who entered the United States without inspection and was arrested could be held without a bond hearing, even if they were later released after their arrest. So basically, we're seeing the number of people who are detained going straight up. And it's quite disgusting because there are people who are making a lot of money off of this expanded detention. We're also seeing prolonged detention, and this is because, there's a few contributing factors. One is that there's a massive backlog to have a case heard in immigration court. So for people who don't just throw in the towel and say, I don't want to be detained, go ahead and deport me, they join the ranks of the 1.1 million people who have pending asylum cases before the immigration court. So you can imagine these are cases that are not moving quickly at all. It is possible to challenge prolonged detention 6 months after you get a final order in your case, which means you have to actually have your hearing. You have to go through the appeal process if you want to appeal. What we've seen is that even for people who get some form of protection, the circumvention of lawful pathways rule makes it unlikely that they're going to qualify for asylum. So many of them are getting Convention Against Torture protection or withholding of removal. This was the situation, you've probably heard the story of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who had withholding of removal to El Salvador and was deported there anyway. And his case is still pending. We've also seen cases of removals to third countries. And that's sort of what happens in that window before someone becomes eligible to make a habeas case to get to ask for their release from prolonged detention. Is during that 6 months, ICE is trying to see if there's a third country that will accept them. There was that case of 14 West Africans who were deported to Ghana and then were subsequently deported from Ghana to their home country. So again, in violation of the forms of protection that they had. And then people being deported, like the 5 people with serious criminal records were told who were deported to South Sudan, which is a war-torn country, very dangerous. So we see sort of protections for detainees falling out of reach. How are we doing on time? I can take a couple of questions if anyone has them about detention.
Yeah, Sabrina, do you have any details about the making money off of preventive detention?
Details. I mean, sorry, this is something.
I mean, what is it? Just private people?
Prison companies that are making a lot of money. So GeoCorp is a big one. CCA are 2 of the big companies. Their business is building private prisons. And because of reforms to our criminal justice system, which are long overdue and certainly more still needs to be done. But this is sort of a new area for the industry to expand because there are so many prisons that have been shuttered. And similarly, state and local jails have sort of had new life breathed into them with this funding. Here in Michigan, most notably, the detention center, there's now a detention center in Baldwin, which is an old, I believe, federal prison that has been rehabbed and is now housing immigrant detainees. They have 1,300 beds. It's one of the largest facilities in the country now. I think it's the 3rd largest facility in the country. So people are like, oh, and Randy mentioned I used to practice in North Dakota. There was a story in our local jail in Grand Forks. They're like, oh, our jail would have shut down a long time ago. It's so great that we're getting this money from ICE beds. So that money is being spread around through the industry in ways that are very critical to keeping jails and prisons open, which depending on how you feel about jails and prisons might not be a good thing.
This is Randy, and
Yeah.
we know that this subject, you could probably have conversations that could last for many more hours than just our short hour this morning. But I wanted to make sure that we got to the part about what kind of actions can we take
right.
to respond to it, as opposed to saying, ain't it awful? And we've got 2 different people who've got their hands up that I'm thinking will honor those questions.
Yeah, that sounds good. And then I'll move straight to the end.
With the 10 minutes left, you told me some things that we can do. So if we can move in that direction so we can stay within our time.
Yep. So I'll take the questions.
Nick?
Just real quick, my understanding is that one thing people didn't realize during past days was that it was perfectly legal. You may be undocumented, but legally here because you were seeking asylum. And you turned yourself in, and then they were paroled or whatever. Because of the lack of sufficient number of ALJs, you never get to the hearing, which is with the bill that Trump stopped during the last Congress. I've heard that they have made some changes on the ability to seek asylum. Can you address that?
Sure. How about I also take the question from Paul, and I'll try to like wrap the
Yeah.
my answers in.
Yeah. Actually, my question was along the same lines. The since that bipartisan bill Trump put thumbs down was supposed to increase the asylum courts so that we could hear all these asylum requests, but the Trump bill, which finally was passed by the Republicans and without Democratic support, that increased all the funding for ICE and the detention. Did it increase any judges for asylum judges, or is that totally neglected again?
Yeah, so it sounds like these are related questions. So I'll talk briefly about HB1 and the fees that were imposed. Yeah, so there's actually judges have been fired en masse, so the number is getting smaller instead of bigger. The response is that the government has put military judges in place to hear these cases. And so that's already happening in the office in Arlington. We'll see if it continues, but it's been like absolutely horrifying for advocates. Um, I'll say briefly, so some of you know about temporary protected status and parole. There are now over 2 million people who've lost status because these programs, some of which in case of TPS have been going on since the 90s, have been terminated out of the blue. Many people haven't had another way to regularize their status, so they find themselves suddenly undocumented. And then, it was mentioned like the huge backlogs in immigration court, the problems at the court they're getting worse instead of better because of the shortage of judges, the infrastructure that's really crumbling. They've eliminated so many positions at the court. Everything is very disorganized and inefficient, which is why I think Trump actually isn't hitting his deportation numbers. He's like arresting people, detaining them self-deport out of fear because the deportation system actually isn't working very well. Um, the HB1 increased the fees, and that's for some of these forms of relief, which has been a huge problem for so many asylum seekers. So there's now, for the first time ever, there's a fee to apply for asylum, not just for the initial fee, but for every year that your application is pending. I've got a client whose application has been pending for 14 years, right? So this idea that they will never actually get to a decision in their case, they're just going to the government's going to collect a fee. Someone's going to have to reposition themselves in front of the government, have their situation re-scrutinized, share information about where they are, like a massive government registration system, right? When they're paying these fees. So there's a lot of wait times, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of barriers to people seeking relief at this time. And a lot of people self-deporting because they just don't feel like this is a place where they can live anymore. But let's talk about the positive things. I'm trauma informed. I like to end on a positive note. So I think there are efforts in the community to make sure that people are meeting their basic needs. This is absolutely huge. So parents are afraid to take their kids to school. Parents are afraid to go to work. They're afraid to even just go out and get groceries. There are mutual aid networks that are helping giving people rides and helping connect them with food and other things that they need. So that they can, wait it out, right, in hopes that things will get better. There are legal needs that people have, and people are helping community members address their legal needs by accompanying them to court or connecting them with legal advice. It's important that people know, what the risks of applying for things are, or if they're better off applying at this time. Um, uh, One thing that I think is really important is this third one, safety and alternatives to law enforcement. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Meta Peace team, but these places that offer training in de-escalation are really, really important. I heard a incredibly distressing story. Somebody who came into one of the clinics where I volunteer and shared this horrible situation about an arrest that took place. And this was somebody who's done like a million Know Your Rights presentations in the community, but so he knew what was going on and he knew how to de-escalate the situation. I can only imagine how bad things could have gotten if he didn't have that training and background. So I think folks who have that training and have that ability are prepared if there's any kind of action. I know that we've reached out to peace teams in the past too when there have been community meetings or sort of other sensitive community gatherings because we've been unwilling to involve law enforcement to protect, the non-citizens who are present. So if people can volunteer in that capacity too is incredibly valuable. And the last thing is telling different stories. There are so many misconceptions out there about immigration. It's amazing the things people believe that just aren't true, right? We know that most non-citizens don't qualify for social benefits and they don't take them, certainly. But many people are working and actually paying into the system so that all of us can take advantage of those programs. We know that non-citizens are less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. So there's just like a lot of things that aren't true. I'm really excited to hear that there's so many of you with labor organizing backgrounds, because another story that I really don't like people saying, and my dad's an immigrant and always thought of himself as very hardworking, but this idea that like immigrants equal hardworking, or like our economy relies on immigrants, I think that's a really damaging narrative because it suggests that people's utility to capitalism is the only thing that matters about them, and they're not worth protecting because they're human, because they're our family members and friends and neighbors. And so that's the kind of story that I tell, right? Like our communities are immigrant based. And I like to say that migration is a natural phenomenon, right? Everything in nature moves in order to save its own life. And that's exactly what people are doing when they're migrating. And so I just say migration is a natural phenomenon, and we're all adapting to it. So, okay, that's it. That's all I have. I'm 2 minutes before noon. If we have time for questions, but I have my email address here. There we go. You should feel free to reach out to me if there's anything you'd like to know about.
So we'll just say that this presentation has been recorded or is being recorded, so that if people want to go back and follow up on some of the details, then we'll send that out to everybody in our network. I guess I had a question. There's a national legislation that would require that ICE agents or agents that are working for law enforcement with immigrants not wear face masks or identity, so you don't know that. So is this person a really official, a legislative public official or not? So is that legislation that you've heard of? And at our national level, we did take a position and sent out information calling for that support for that legislation.
Yes, this is where I mentioned that the state's attorneys generals were writing in support of this. I think it's incredibly important given the number of showing